rules. Oh, sorry. Yeah, we're recording this one. That I put into effect a couple weeks ago. They were brought up because of issues that arose due mostly to things that used to be in our rules, but were not in the most recent version prior to this. The reason for that is that the society rewrite of the rules that came out in 2021 left a lot of things out that were in there prior. They left a lot of things up to individual kingdoms to employ or not. And there were some things which were causing safety concerns for us. So with the support of our KEM, I went ahead and added those back into our rules. So there have been a few actual changes. There's other things I'm going to talk about that are not rule changes since our last update came out in 2021, but are cultural changes that are still new for some people. All right, so I'm just going to start at the front of the handbook and go through those changes. The handbook, by the way, is available on the website in the document library. I've also posted about it in Mid-Realm Social Club, in the Kingdom Facebook page, and in the Marshal's Facebook page, but it is available on the website. Okay, so the first big change is that prior to now, spears have been an advanced authorization for us, requiring a 6-month waiting period from initial authorization to being able to authorize and spear. That 6-month waiting period is now removed. So initial authorization, as in any rapier society-wide, is still with single sword, but once someone has their single sword, they can go straight to their spear authorization if they wish. This is based on other kingdoms having done away with this requirement and not seeing any major changes in safety issues, things like that. So we have done away with that. That is a change to what was 2.3.1M in the handbook. So while it can't be initial, it can be immediately afterwards, just like any other secondary authorization. The next one is not actually a change to the rules since the 2021 version, but it is one that has not been widely understood or used because it is a change to our culture from previous to that. And that is that a hold does not need to be called if a weapon or parry device is dropped, unless it is an immediate safety hazard. Right, so it used to be that anytime something hit the ground, everyone called hold, we removed it. But with the current set of rules based on the society rules, unless it's an immediate safety hazard, like someone's literally about to step on it, we don't need to call hold for that. And a lot of times this comes up more in melee than it does in single combat, where, you know, someone drops their sword and someone else calls hold and now 40 people are waiting just because the guy next to me happened to drop his sword and he can reach down and pick it up again, right? It's not a safety issue. It's not an injury. He just dropped it for a second and he's picking it back up. So no longer need to call a hold for that. Obviously, if it is an immediate danger or if it looks as though someone's injured and that's why they dropped it, call hold, right? Okay. Next is also not a change, and it's not necessarily a shift in our culture either, but it is one that I have seen several people get incorrect on the Marshal's test. And I've also heard Marshals misquoting this, so I want to clarify in these meetings. It is that in a melee, combatants are engaged with all opponents as soon as lay on is called. What that means is that all combatants need to have a 360-degree awareness around them. It does not mean we can now hit people in the kidneys, right? We still have that 180-degree striking area, but we need to be aware of everyone around us because we are engaged with all the opponents as soon as lay on is called, not just the people in our 180. Does that make sense? Okay. So someone in my last class asked a really good question about the 180. They said, is it from your head or from your shoulders that you should consider your 180, or from your opponent's head or shoulders? This is not defined by society. My personal definition, because it makes the most logical sense in most of the situations I've seen, is that your 180 is from where your shoulders are facing. Because if I'm facing towards you and I look over my shoulder and you hit me in this shoulder, that does not mean you were out of my 180, right? Make sense to everybody? Whereas if my shoulders are this way and my head is this way and you hit me here, that's my back, right? So it's not based on where your head is facing, it's based on where your shoulders are facing or your opponent's shoulders, okay? Also, somebody can turn their heads a lot faster than they can turn their bodies. So it's much more likely that you're going to strike within the 180 if you're following where their body is facing. Okay. The next, again, this is not a change from our 2021 rules, but it is a change from prior rules because it's based on that new society change. And that is that no washers are required under a tip. So I hear a lot of marshals when they're doing inspections, still asking people what's under your tip. That is no longer a question that we need to ask. If you look at the society rules or our rules exactly follow the society here. We have not added any mid-realm addenda. What it says about the blade covering is a minimum depth. So it says rubber and polymer tips must have a minimum of 1/8 inch between the striking surface and the tip or edge of the sword. Leather must be at a minimum of 1.6 millimeters, 1/16 of an inch, or 4 ounces of thickness. Okay, so for example, event 2 weeks ago, someone came up to me with a sword that he said marshals were trying to bounce it because it looked weird. Okay, this sword had an unusually wide blade, but it met the flex requirements. And the covering that he had prepared for it was a piece of leather that would cover the end and overlap at the edges, and another piece of leather to go under that just at the tip of the sword, because the single piece of leather by itself was not thick enough to meet that requirement, but those two pieces together were. So I said, yeah, as long as you've got that taped on and it's securely taped to the blade and it's a contrasting color of tape, you're good to go. It met the flex requirements, it met the tip coverage requirements. So make sure that you refresh yourself if you need to on that definition of what the required tip coverage is. It's under section 6.2.9 and 6.2.10 in the rules if you're looking for it. And it falls under the larger section of description of weapons and defensive objects, which is section 6. Okay. Another one that some people miss, and it's tricky, is that there's a rule 6.2.12.3. It's buried pretty deep, but it says a nut or other blunt metal object designed to spread impact may be welded to the tip of rapier and cut and thrust blades, so long as care is taken to prevent damage to the temper of the blade. Okay, so you might think, well, that doesn't happen very often. Here's where it happens. If someone has a 45 or a 42 and it snaps close to the end, right? They may still want to use that as a functioning blade, but now they've got basically a sharp end on it. So they can weld something to the end to make it blunt again, to make it usable, but they have to be careful in doing that, that they don't change the temper, which means they probably need to go to someone with welding experience. Okay. But that is allowable as long as the blade still meets the flex requirements, as long as it's securely attached, as long as it doesn't change that temper. Okay. All right, next, some questions about rubber-headed spears. I'm smiling because I have no personal issue with spears, but they have been kind of a thorn in my side since taking on this position, just because of various issues that have arisen with them. So the first question I've been getting a lot is, we have had some folks who were experimenting with 3D printed spearheads, not as an official Kingdom experiment, but just to see, could it be done? Could they be made flexible enough? Could they be made stable enough? Thus far, the answer is no. But the other question was, in the society rules where it talks about spearheads, it says that you must purchase them from a commercial vendor. We have been asking for months for a definition of commercial vendor. Does that mean I can hand my 3D printed spearheads to my buddy who is vending at an event and he can sell them to my friends? Right? Does that mean that I can come up with some viable spearheads from my 3D printer and hand them to Master Eric and have him sell them? Can I put them up in my Etsy shop? Like, what does commercially available mean? And we have not gotten an answer. So my recommendation is, to be safe, purchase your spearheads and tell everyone else to purchase their spearheads from a known vendor. Here's the problem with that. I'm guessing by now most of you have heard of the issues with the cold steel heads. For those of you who have not, in brief, when spears became a recognized weapons form, so they were no longer experimental, they became a weapons form society-wide, which is now about 2 years ago. All of a sudden, there was a lot more demand for spearheads. And the quality went down sharply. And not just the quality, but the makeup of the spearheads from one batch to another. Right? Someone would order one, it would show up, it would be completely fine. The next person would order one, it would show up, it would be way too soft, so it would pass the flex test, but it would break on the third strike. The next person would order one, and it's so stiff that it won't pass the flex test. And Cold Steel has been contacted multiple times about this issue. Their only response is that they'll send you a new one. They have no interest in actually fixing the quality control problem. So they are not disallowed from combat, but what I have been recommending to people is save your money, purchase from somewhere else, because you don't know when you buy it whether you're going to get one that you can actually use or not. I've heard very good things about the Purple Heart spearheads. I know there's a couple other commercial vendors out there, but right now I can't in good conscience recommend Cold Steel because it might not pass inspection, and if it does, it might fail on the third strike. I will let people know if I ever get a response on that commercially available question. So hopefully we can get some better spearhead availability going. Okay. This is going to sound a little bit like harping if you've seen my posts on Facebook. However, this is very important. Society rules state that a rubber-headed spear consists of a rattan haft up to a certain diameter, a rubber spearhead, and tape to hold that head on. Nothing else. The spearhead is to be press fit to the haft and taped on. No epoxy, no caulk, no glue, no tape, no spray paint, nothing goes under that head except the haft, and that is by society rules. All right. Okay. Moving along, that was all construction and use of weapons, or construction of offensive and defensive weapons. Then we are now on to use of weapons and defensive objects, which is the section 7. So I had some people asking, particularly with spears, well, can I grab the opponent's spear haft and pull it away from them? And I said, no. Have we ever allowed you to, for example, grab your opponent's guard on their sword and pull it away from them, or grab the edge of their buckler and pull it off of them? No, you can't pull on the spear haft. And they said, well, it's not in the rules. And I said, we can fix that. So there are now a couple of mid-realm addenda. One is that it's 7.4.4M, all the mid-realm addenda are signified with an M, says no combatant may grab the haft of an opponent's spear and attempt to pull or wrestle it away from the opponent. Spear hafts may be manipulated with an open hand. So much like how we treat a blade or someone's defensive object, people can push it all they want. They may not exert force on it. That becomes wrestling or grappling over it, and that is not allowed. In a similar way, 7.11M says combatants may not pull or exert force on an opponent's weapon or parry device in a way which constitutes wrestling for control of the weapon or device. So same thing. And that's how we've always trained it. But It was not included in the most recent edition of the society rules, and so therefore was not in our rules, but that has now been fixed. All right. We already talked about that. Oh, okay. So next, and this has to do particularly for marshals when it comes to inspecting people. I have heard marshals as recently as a month ago quoting the overlap rule, that we have to have a certain amount of overlap so that no skin shows during combat. That rule was done away with the most recent edition of the society rules, which again was 2021. So we're now 2 years into this. What they are calling fleeting skin showing, which means I lunge and my pant leg rides up a little bit and you can see a sliver of my calf, right? I extend my arm fully and a tiny bit of my wrist shows where my sleeve pulls back, right? Those are not a concern. What is a concern is if someone has skin showing at all times, or if someone, God forbid, has skin showing where they need puncture-resistant armor, right? Nothing on their torso should ever be showing skin. Do not show up on my list wearing a crop top. It's not going to go well. Okay? So, wrists, ankles, right? Or if you're one of the guys wearing the short pants with the tall socks, maybe right under your knee, fleeting skin is okay. Being able to see skin at all times, not okay. And we should never see skin where we require puncture-resistant armor. All right, and that falls under the armoring rules, which is section 9. One change that was made in the society rules, and it's one that we need to be aware of again when we're doing inspections, is that rather than specifically asking about rigid armor for covering external reproductive organs, as it was stated before, they now include any part of the person vulnerable to significant serious injury or disproportionate bleeding must be required by rigid protection. The way that I have addressed this in training marshals and in doing inspections is rather than asking, hey, you wearing your cup? I say, are you wearing all required protection? Right? And I know in some circles, people don't even ask. They're like, well, that's on them if they forget it. But let me tell you how many times I've inspected someone, and this includes mods, who I've said, are you wearing all your required protection? And they go, oh yeah, I'll be right back. Right? It's better to ask and have someone be safe than just to not ask because it's an awkward question. But you can leave it at, are you wearing all required protection? Right? Okay. Okay, so incident reports. You've probably seen me harping about this too, because there's a lot of misunderstandings about incident reports. So incident reports are required if there's an injury that requires someone to leave the field, even briefly, or an equipment failure. Okay. Now, those are kind of vague, so I've had a lot of questions about this. First and foremost, I would always much rather have you file a report than not file a report. So if you're not sure, go ahead and file a report, right? Because I can always say, thanks, not really needed, but thank you, I appreciate it. If someone needs to leave the field, even if it's for 5 minutes, because of something that happened while they were fighting, that's a reportable incident. So let me give you some examples because I've had lots of questions. If someone says, oh, I'm really tired, I'm going to go sit for a minute, that is not a reportable injury. If someone says, oh, that headshot was really hard and I'm kind of dizzy, I think I need to go sit, that is a reportable injury. right? It is directly related to something that happened on the field to them that has created the potential for a larger problem. Okay. People have asked questions about heat injuries. Most of us are not medics, right? We no longer have a society group of medics to call on, but we all should at least have common sense, right? If someone's just sweating and a little bit red, they're probably okay. It's completely fine as a marshal to say, hey, have you had water lately? Or, hey, why don't you go get a drink, right? If someone is wobbly, if their eyes look a little unfocused, any of those kind of things, they need to be sat down immediately, because that means that they could be having a heat issue, right? And again, this is one of those things where it's better to ask somebody to take a seat and have to write an incident report about it than it is to ignore it and figure, they're adults, they can take care of themselves, and end up calling EMS. Okay. Yeah, the OSHA Heat app does allow you to set reminders, but it's not always about even the real field temp. This was something I made a point of a couple months ago, because someone brought up the OSHA app, and the OSHA app is great. I highly recommend that any marshal in charge has it installed on their phone, because it will tell you when temperatures are reaching unsafe limits. However, we all know, because we all live in the Midwest, that 80 in April and 80 in August are not the same temperature to our bodies, right? So something that I have asked some marshals to mandate anytime that they're marshal in charge for an event is to have mandatory water breaks. And yet you can't force someone to go get a drink of water, but you can shut down the field for 5 minutes and tell people that it's a water break. Right? We know lots of people get out there and they're having a really great time and they just want to keep fighting and they're not paying any attention to signs from their body that they're getting dehydrated. So every hour or so, shut down the field for a few minutes, tell people it's a water break. They can come back out and play more later. And like I said, you can't force them to get a drink, but if you give them a break and you don't allow them to play during that time, it's much more likely that they're going to. All right. The incident report form is available on the Mid-Realm site. I highly recommend that anyone who's marshal in charge of an event or marshal in charge of a practice, or even just a marshal, have a couple copies to keep with them, because that way it's on hand, you've got it ready. Most incidents, if they're not serious, only need to go to a regional marshal. If it's serious, like it requires further medical attention, it needs to come to me. The timelines for that are all outlined in our rules. So in general, incident reports need to be reported to the regional and then up to me within 2 weeks of an event or practice where they occur. And then they go with my quarterly report to the society marshal within 3 months. However, anything that requires hospitalization or similar care, if you have to make an EMS call, then that needs to come to me within 24 hours of the incident, if at all possible. Now, I recognize that there are times when that is not possible, but it needs to come to me as soon as possible. And that's not only so that I have a record of what happened, our insurance requires that. So please help us stay compliant with our insurance and send serious incident reports to me. My email, which hopefully all of you know, is rapier@midrealm.org. And I am reachable that way. I'm also often reachable through Facebook Messenger. If you're just like, hey, I need to send this to you, where do I send it? So you can fill in the report form, take a picture of it, email it. Easy as that. You don't have to worry about scanning it, anything like that. A picture in good light where I can read it is fine. You probably all saw my very teacher-like post about a week ago saying, I can't even believe I have to say this, but please make your report forms legible, right? If I can't read it, it doesn't do anybody any good, right? And just as an FYI, I work with elementary children. I can read most handwriting. If I can't read your handwriting, you need to fix it, right? Practice block printing if you have to, but I need to be able to read your report. All right. current state for the grappling experiment, because I've had some people asking, right? Everybody hopefully at this point knows that grappling was shut down pending reapproval, because it was discovered that we have not had reapproval for it in like 9 years. And we don't have any paperwork on file showing actual approval for it in the first place. When that was requested from society by my predecessor, he received one form with one signature on it. It needs more than that. So I was told that in order to stay compliant, we needed reapproval of it. So it was shut down. The way it currently stands is that grappling is back on until Penzic. We are appealing to the SEM for reapproval, but at the moment, the SRM has said you can do it until Penzic, and after that, it's done. So hopefully it will get reapproved. Hopefully our appeal will go through, but that's where it stands right now. Grappling is on until Penzic. All right. The last thing is that in the rules, it does not define what a tip cut, a draw cut, and a push cut are as far as the distance needed to be traveled for them to be valid. Right. So we have always trained that a draw cut is 6 inches or the width of the limb. So that has been put in as a mid-realm addenda, that is what is required back in the appendix. What this means for a tip cut is that the tip must travel 6 inches or the width of a limb. A lot of people in our kingdom, especially because tip cuts were not really a thing here before a couple of years ago, get frustrated with tip cuts because anyone can do a sloppy hit and then call it a tip cut. Not when you need 6 inches of travel, right? Same for a push cut. I can't bounce my sword into your arm and call it a push cut. 6 inches of travel, just like a draw cut. Okay. Speaking of tip cuts and draw cuts, or tip cuts and push cuts rather, they are valid blows in our kingdom and have been for a couple of years. However, because we're still training for them, and a lot of people aren't used to them, if you intend to use them in a one-on-one fight, it's recommended that you discuss this with your opponent ahead of time. It's not to make them valid. They are always valid. It's so that everyone is thinking about them as valid shots. Does that make sense? Because especially those of us who've been fencing for 20 years and 18 of those years, they were not valid. It's not in our brains, right? So discussion ahead of time is good, but discussion or no, they are still valid blows. Okay. If you happen to be a marshal that runs a practice, it would be a really good idea to start training people for this. Right. Especially because at Penzic, they're also going to be valid. And a lot of people get frustrated when their hits don't get taken because we're not trained for it. Okay. I think that's, oh, this one is not a change. This is actually from something that came up at the last class. Chainmail armor does not need to be drop tested. It falls outside of those rules. If you drop test someone's chainmail, you will break it and you will owe them a new shirt. 2, you can still wear chainmail if it's missing a single ring. If it's missing 2 rings next to each other, now it has a hole in it and it's not valid armor. It needs to be repaired. Okay. That hole can be repaired with what I have always thought of as a jump ring. So a ring that overlaps to close, not a butted ring, a jump ring that overlaps. You cannot have more than 2 of these, sorry, more than 1 of these next to each other. Okay. Because this has the potential to open up and then you have a hole again. If you have 2 of these next to each other and they both open up, now you have a really big hole. Okay. So when you're inspecting someone's armor, check their chainmail for holes or ask them about it, and make sure that they don't have big gaps that have been closed with jump rings or butted rings, because then it's not safe. Right? Okay, I believe that is it directly from the rules. In regards to this Marshal training, you have now attended a class. The other half of the Marshal continuing education is to take the Marshal's test. That is available. The link to it is on the Mid-Realm website. I've also posted it several times. If you need it, you can email me or ping me on Facebook Messenger. It is an open book test. The main function of it is to make sure that you have thoroughly read the current set of rules. They've changed quite a bit with the society rewrite in 2020, and I want to make sure all my Marshals are up to date. Once you have taken a class, which you just did, and taken the test, there's a very brief form, which I've posted several times. It's in that document about continuing education. And it pretty much just says, when did you take a class? When did you complete the test? And your name and membership number, because all Marshals still have to be members. Make sure that people know that. I know we are no longer a pay-to-play kingdom, but Marshals are officers. Officers have to have membership numbers, have to have memberships. Okay. All right. I know there were some questions in chat that I missed. Let me go back and look. Okay. All right. It was suggested that kingdom or society specify national standards for the rubber or polymer spear tip. To be 100% honest, if we can't even get society to answer us about what commercially available means, we're not going to get them to specify that. It would be great if we could. That would be wonderful in an ideal world, but for right now, we have the flex test, and that's about all we have. Oh, and asking people how their spear is constructed to make sure there's nothing else under the tip. Okay, talking about OSHA stuff. Okay, yeah, Nighthawk, I've heard that story from several people that somebody got hurt and no report was filed. If someone needs to leave the field for any period of time, please make sure the Marshal in charge knows, because a report can be filed by any Marshal at an event, but the Marshal in charge should know, because then they need to include it in their event report.
Oh, I didn't find out about it until the next day when my daughter told me about it.
Right. And I've heard several stories of, I took a hard headshot and my head kind of hurt, but I thought it was nothing. And then I ended up going to urgent care on Monday and it was a concussion. That's something that should have been reported. If you thought you had a head injury, you should have reported it. So yeah, we just need to be more vigilant about filing that stuff. And part of it is to make sure people are safe, to make sure we don't have repeat offenders. And that's a question that I often ask Marshals when they tell me about an incident is this someone who has been a known problem, or was this just a random accident, right? Hard hits happen, but if it's someone for whom it's happening event after an event after an event, we need to have a chat. Okay, OSHA measurements, we talked about that. So the test requirements, I know Celestria asked this and other people have asked this. If you have taken the test within the last year, you do not need to take it again, right? So people who finished their MIT in the last year, you don't have to go take it again. You already took it, right? And on that form, I don't remember how I worded it, but it said, if you're exempt, put exempt under what was the date you completed the test. Right. Snowden, that's a really good question about chainmail shirts. She asked if someone has a chainmail shirt but already has a regular shirt over it, should they remove the shirt to inspect the chainmail? My personal feeling on this is that theoretically we are all authorized adults going out there. If I ask someone if they are wearing all required protection and they say yes, then that has to be good enough, right? We work on an honor system. I'm not going to make someone pull off all their gear to double check things. Okay. Now, if you know that someone who's a completely new person is going out there, like they're getting their authorization today, you may want to be a little bit more thorough and ask them about specific items. You know, are you wearing your chainmail shirt? Did you remember to put on your gorget? Things like that. But unless they're very, very new, we should all be aware of what protective armor we're required to have. And if a marshal says, are you wearing all required protective gear? And we say yes, then that's it. Okay. All right. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
You were talking about welding a nut on the end of a sword that's had a couple of inches broken off. What about just grinding it down, getting a Dremel and then rounding the end off?
Rounding the edge is not enough to spread force. You need something on the end to spread force.
But that's the way,
So like,
that's the way they are now. The tip of a sword is still flat with a rounded end for the most part.
typically the ones that we have a blunt end on the end of them.
All right.
The ones that I've seen commercially available mostly have a blunt end on them.
All right.
So it doesn't actually affect the people.
All right. Any other questions? Yes, Bartholomew?
Yeah, the ones from Zen Warrior do not have a blunt end.
Nope.
Interesting. Okay. Well, by society rules, they still don't need anything over them except a tip that meets the thickness requirements. Okay. Any other questions?
Something else I wanted to ask. I forgot it.
All right. Okay. So since there don't seem to be any other questions right now, if you think of any later, again, please Rapier at midrealm.org. Or you can find me on Facebook under Abigail Myers. You probably see me post all the time, so you can message me. I will be reposting that continuing education document so everyone has access to the links to the test and to the form saying that you've done both pieces. I'm assuming since you're taking the class now, you will probably take the test soon, but just in case, the deadline is September 16th to have done both of those. The reason for that deadline is that is a week before fall coronation, which is traditionally when warrants are re-signed. So following that deadline, I'm going to cross-check against our marshals lists, and anyone who has not done it will no longer have a marshalate after coronation.
Where can we get the tests?
I will repost the document. Actually, I can put a link in the chat here. Hold on just a second. Send to everyone. Sorry, I have a lot more experience with Google Meets than with Zoom because my school district decided to go the Google Education route.
Oh.
Okay.
I got another question for you.
Hold on just a second. Making sure I spelled that right. Yes. Okay. That is the link to the test. Okay.
For Marshall's reports,
Yes.
can we still use the online version of the Marshall's reports, or do we need to send them in separate?
No, you'd still use the online one.
Yeah, because I've been using the one from the portal.
Okay, the portal one is no longer valid. I have asked several times that it just be shut down, and they have not. But the one that I've been posting and that is listed on the Midrealm site is the correct one.
Okay.
All right. Oh, thanks, Farthen. You're welcome. And thanks, Adam. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Well, as I said, if you need anything from me, please email or message me. And I hope everyone has a good night. Thanks for coming to the class.
Thanks, Mary. Bye. Take care.
You too.